In the next series of 3 videos, I'm going to talk about conversation analysis. First, I'm going to tell you about an academic crush, a geek crush of mine. This is a picture of a fellow named Harvey Sachs. And Harvey Sachs was the young sociologist who began to explore conversation in a way that nobody had before. And he was responsible for many of the ideas that you'll hear about in this video. It's difficult to introduce you to Harvey Sachs's work because the thing he studied seems so ordinary: conversation. All of you have conversations every day and are probably pretty good at it. And it's hard then to see a conversation as something strange or unusual or amazing or complicated. You have them every day, so what's the big deal? But conversations are very interesting things when you spend enough time looking at them. Listen to a conversation 17 times, very carefully. On the 18th time, you might hear something new. Conversations are amazing accomplishments. They involve a great deal of work, although we don't notice how much work we're doing in a conversation. Harvey Sachs basically invented a new way of looking at conversations. For one thing, he looked at conversations as conversations. He didn't look at conversations as being about this or about that, so much as just being. He also looked at conversations. He didn't just listen. With the help of his friends, he found ways of transcribing conversations and making them visible. He would listen repeatedly and make notes of all the pauses, the noises, and the indrawn breath, the little laughs, and he would talk about how they contributed to the conversation. Through doing the work of making them visible, he paid attention to them in a way that we wouldn't normally do. Now, Harvey was very interested in how people did things through conversation, not so much what they did or what they talked about, but how they did it and how they talked about it. And this was the most interesting part for Harvey. For example, Harvey was working at a suicide counseling hotline in the 1960s. People would phone, and one of the first things the counselors wanted to do would be to make a connection. Having a name to call the person by helped to make that personal connection. Obviously, though, some people would have hung up if you just said, "What's your name?" So Harvey noticed that the counselors would begin like this.
Hello.
Hello.
This is Mr. Smith. May I help you?
Yes, this is Mr. Brown.
So most people would reply to, "This is Mr. Smith, may I help you?" with something like, "Yes, this is Mr. Brown." Or perhaps today it would be more informal and we'd say, "Hi, this is Bob," and "Yes, this is Tom." So this is an expected response. By giving his name, Mr. Smith was almost obliging the person to give their name. Then one day, Harvey heard a rather different conversation. It went like this.
This is Mr. Smith. May I help you?
I can't hear you.
This is Mr. Smith.
Smith.
By not hearing, or perhaps pretending not to hear, person B resists giving his or her name. And it seems like a small discovery. But this little snippet of conversation, the little strategy involved on the part of B, the little move employed by B, got Harvey thinking about how conversations worked, how these little moves take place, all these little maneuvers we make as part of conversations. Now, you've studied syntax as part of your studies of linguistics. One of the major figures behind syntax and one of the major linguists of our time would be Noam Chomsky. He came up with a lot of the stuff around syntax that around the same time that Harvey was working on his PhD. Noam Chomsky said that conversations were too disorganized to study. He said you couldn't study conversations, they were too messy, there was too much going on, and he focused instead on sample sentences. Harvey said that, on the contrary, conversations are highly organized and therefore can be studied. Harvey's work was considered a little strange in its time, and he liked to create trouble. He almost never got his PhD because he refused to back down from the famous sociologist Harold Garfinkel, who was on his PhD thesis committee. Garfinkel was later asked, "Is it true that Harvey Sachs was your student?" And Garfinkel answered, "What do you mean? I was his student." It took about 10 or 11 years for Harvey's ideas to catch on. During this time, he completed his graduate work and got a PhD and taught for a few years. Finally, in 1975, Harvey was invited to start a new program at the University of California where he could really explore his ideas. On the drive down, he died in a car crash. Still, the next time you get into an argument with a computer on the telephone and the computer's steering you this way or that, Harvey's had an influence there. The next time you're looking at a dialogue in a textbook on classroom behavior and you see all this complex stuff noting pauses and breaths, Harvey's had an influence there as well. One of the important things to look at in conversations are how you identify the roles. When you're transcribing conversations, how do you identify the people in the conversation? Are you going to call them Bill and John, for example? In this dialogue, you can see Bill and John, you see their personal names.
Did you feel sick?
A little bit, yes.
How does it feel when you read the dialogue and read their personal names? Compare it with how the dialogue feels when you read it without the personal names, when we remove the names and refer to them by letters. Here we have the letters A and B to refer to the two speakers.
Did you feel sick?
A little bit, yes.
We've removed a level of information. We know a little less about the speakers. There's a little less space for us to interpret the context. There's less space to interpret the context, maybe focuses us more on the text. It's less about people, Bill and John. We don't know if it's man, we don't know if it's a man and a woman or a woman and a man. We don't know what their relationship is with each other. We just know they are A and B. So we have a little less information about the people or the context, but we have the same amount of information about the text. And this might shift the focus to the text a little bit. It would be very different if we talked about their roles, as in doctor or patient. So how does this conversation change when A is doctor and B is the patient?
Did you feel sick?
A little bit, yes.
What difference does it make whether Bill asks John, "Did you feel sick?" as compared to when the doctor asks the patient, "Did you feel sick?" If you were gathering data from a classroom, you would have to decide if you wanted to introduce the role of student and teacher, or if you wanted the conversation itself to show you how someone performs being a teacher through conversation. If we had a long conversation from the classroom and it was just labeled A or B, would you be able to tell whether A was a teacher or B was a teacher by the way they spoke? You probably would. But by removing the title teacher and student, we focus more attention on the way they spoke and how that performs the role of being the teacher. So that's a decision you would have to make if you were transcribing a conversation. Another thing that we pay attention to when transcribing conversations are the sounds as they are uttered. All the little ums and ahs are important. Words that are begun and not finished are important. Laughter's important, and you should make note of these things. You should record them as they sound to you. When recording laughter in a conversation, we use H's. 1 H equals 1 second of laughter. Well, here's a dialogue, and you see lots of ums and ahs recorded as they sound. You see a yeah, you see an
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun, no kidding.
It really is. I mean, we used to come down on the trolley cars
Yeah.
and bring we only had, Anne and my cousin Anne.
Mm-hmm.
So they're recording the conversation with all the little sounds, all the little utterances. Now here there's some debate. What if you're speaking to a person, or what if you're recording a conversation and one of the people speaks with an accent? How would you record non-standard speech? Would you write it out using typographic conventions that might look a little bit like they came from a comic strip, or would you use the International Phonetic Alphabet to write out these non-standard words? How would you draw attention to the fact that one of the words was spoken in a way that would be non-standard? If you wanted to focus on non-standard speech, one of the options would be to use the International Phonetic Alphabet. This becomes an interesting question for us involved in English as a second language teaching and research, because it's important when words are incomprehensible. It's important when words are mispronounced, when you're studying how people speak in their second language. One thing you can do when you're transcribing a conversation, if you hear words that you don't understand, if the sounds are incomprehensible, you can simply note them by a series of question marks. Look at this conversation. The 2.2 there represents a 2.2 second pause. Listen to this conversation without the pause, and listen to the conversation with the pause.
This chemotherapy, it won't have any lasting effects on having kids, will it? It will?
I'm afraid so.
This chemotherapy, it won't have any lasting effects on having kids, will it? It will?
I'm afraid so.
That 2.2 second pause is pretty powerful. It's a very powerful little pause. The patient actually has asked a question and feels and hears the doctor answer through the doctor's silence. This chemotherapy, it won't have any lasting effect on having kids, will it? Obviously, the patient wants a yes answer. A yes would be the preferred answer here. The doctor doesn't want to give what's called a dispreferred response, so the doctor remains quiet. The patient realizes this and says, "It will?" And the doctor says, "I'm afraid so." So you could just, so in recording pauses, it's typical to use the number of seconds of the pause if the pause is longer than a half second. Another thing that's important to note when recording conversations is overlaps. Interruptions, for example, are very important. They're interesting. You might be interested in studying who interrupts more, men or women. And if you wanted to transcribe conversations to show who interrupts more, you'd need to make sure to clearly mark them for your readers. You might also be interested in how men interrupt versus how women interrupt. So overlapping speech sounds is very interesting, whether it interrupts or not. Here's an example of some overlapping speech sounds.
It really is. I mean, we used to come down on the trolley cars
Yeah.
and bring the.
So Seal says it really is. I mean, we used to come down on the trolley cars and bring the, and between trolley cars and bring the, Anne says, yeah. Anne is doing this to show that she's listening. She's not really interrupting. So this is called a back channel. Back channeling cues are very important, and in transcribing conversations, we want to pay attention to them. So we mark the overlap here using the equal signs to show that Seal's speech is continuous and doesn't stop, although Anne has made a comment in between. Another way of showing overlaps is demonstrated on lines 6 and 7 in this dialogue, as well as on lines 5 and 6. So the host is talking, the caller starts to starts to respond in the middle of the hosts saying therefore. The caller starts to say no, but dogs can be and starts to say dogs can be trained. And then, as you see on line 7, the host says, I haven't finished. So those little lines, those little straight lines interrupting the word therefore and interrupting the word trained show when one of them has started to speak in the middle while the other is speaking. So that's another option in transcribing text to show overlapped speech or interrupted speech. The difference here between what happened before, the back channeling, and what's happening now is they're both overlapping speech, but in this case, the overlapping speech is treated as an interruption. So at what point does an overlap become an interruption? When somebody says it is. Or when one person refuses to cede the floor to the other who has begun talking.
Well, did you explain that? You understood that. You know dogs have the call of nature, just as there are people, and they don't have the same kind of control, and so
No,
therefore,
but dogs can be
no,
trained.
I haven't finished. So, therefore, the owner being there has the responsibility. And they don't have the same kind of control, and so
No,
therefore,
but dogs can be
no,
trained.
I haven't finished. And they don't have the same kind of control, and so
No,
therefore,
but dogs can be
no,
trained.
I haven't finished.